Respected Professor P Balram, Chairman of CSIR-NGRI Research Council, Professor P.S. Goyal, members of CSIR-NGRI Research Council, fellow directors of CSIR Labs, my dear colleagues, students who joined through virtual media. Good morning to all of you. It's our great pleasure when we celebrate our 60 years of continued sustaining technological and scientific progress in geosciences. We are pleased to have today with us one of the very eminent scientists of the country, Professor P Balram. He does not need any introduction. Nevertheless, I must tell you, those who had been benefited like me over the decades with his editorial, probably hundreds, 300 or 400 numbers, in which in each issue of the current science he used to write, had been really fascinating to read. I am reminded of one of the editorial which he has written exactly 10 years back, and the title of the editorial was Being Busy. I do not know how many of you who have read this, but though I have read it 10 years back, but I realized that when I joined as a director 5 years back, first at Trivandrum and then here, the message in the editorial, which has been put by Professor Balaram, was so loud and clear, has been not only helping, but also making a good impact when I take some of the things which has been mentioned in the editorial. And it talks of the cognitive surplus because of the unproductive use of the free time. And that message, if we see in the today's world, and if you see the editorial, it talks of the online development, and you will appreciate that how visionary was he, even talking of 10 years back, that there could be a time when we are meeting on online and be discussing many of the very important things while we use our time productively. So there cannot be more pleasure than having Professor Balaram with us when we celebrate our Diamond Jubilee, and also with us our Chairman of the Research Council, Professor P.S. Goyal. I am very delighted to welcome all of you and hope that you all will be even more benefited with today's talk, which Professor Balaram has kindly agreed to deliver at CSIR-NGRI virtually. With this, I once again welcome all the colleagues who joined through web media and thank Professor Balaram to be with us for sharing his thought at the time when we plan to retrospect and think for the future of science, particularly the science of the earth in coming years. Thank you. Professor
Sir, muted, now, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari, and a very good morning and a warm welcome to all of you, particularly the dignitaries. We have Professor P Balram, we have our RSC chairman, Professor Goel. I think also we have Dr. R.N. Singh and several other RSC members, directors who must have joined online, scientists of NGRI, various students. A warm welcome to all of you. And I'm very glad to state that NGRI, which has been a top earth science research institute in the country, has galloped into its 60th year of existence, playing a key role, a key leadership role for the country in the last 60 years. Several great achievements we look back and feel very proud about. So this year we have decided to celebrate the occasion through various new initiatives. We are planning to introduce several schemes, several fellowships, and also to encourage students on newer topics, which are frontier topics of research globally, and until October next year, when we shall be completing the 60 years of CSIR NGRI. Last month we had a talk by a very eminent personality, Professor Annie Cazeneva, who from France, who is a recipient of an award which is equivalent to the Nobel Prize in Earth Sciences. And this time we have a very eminent person, Professor P Balram, and I must really thank him for having agreed to our suggestion. Immediately he agreed to deliver this second Diamond Jubilee lecture. And before I invite him to deliver the talk of the day, may I request Dr. Ram Mohan to briefly read the CV of Professor Balaram. Although most of us know the very eminent person, Padma Bhushan, Padmavan Balaraman sir, everybody knows, but I would request Ram Mohan to please briefly read out the CV, and then sir, it will be over to you.
Good morning all. Let me take the privilege to introduce today's eminent speaker, Professor Padmavan Balaram, one of the well-known research personalities of India. Currently, he is the Emeritus Professor at Molecular Biophysics Unit, Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. Professor Balaram's primary scientific interest is in the structure, conformation, and biological activity of designed and natural peptides. Professor Balaram has graduated from the Ferguson College, Pune, and has completed the Masters in Chemistry from IIT Kanpur. He has obtained PhD from the Carnegie Mellon University in 1972 and was the postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University for a short time under the Nobel laureate Professor Robert Burns Woodward. He served the Indian Institute of Science for more than 36 years at various capacities, and he has more than 520 papers and 3 patents to his credit. He has contributed immensely to the science in India as the director of Indian Institute of Science and also as the editor of Current Science. As the editor of Current Science, he used to comment on a wide range of issues related to science in India through his legendary editorials. He has been the member of many science policy making bodies. He is bestowed with Padma Bhushan by the Government of India in the year 2014, the 3rd highest civilian award for his contributions to Indian science. He is the fellow of all 3 science academies of India. Professor Balaram is an outstanding communicator, both in speech and also in writing. I am sure he will have valuable thoughts to share with us today. With this brief introduction, I welcome Professor P Balram to deliver the CSIR-NGRI Diamond Jubilee second lecture. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much. May I share my screen?
Yes, sir. Please.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
You can see that. I'll make it full screen.
Yes, sir.
Is it visible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, very much. Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's indeed a privilege for me to give this lecture at NGRI, particularly because I am not an earth scientist at all. I have always worked in areas which border chemistry and biology. So when Dr. Rao called me and asked me whether I would give this lecture, I told him I would only be able to talk about a subject which is on the border of chemistry and biology, but maybe of some general interest also to earth scientists. So the topic of my presentation was really chemistry, biology, and the unity of nature. And as this first slide shows you, I've put up two of the pillars of modern chemistry and modern biology. On the left, you see the picture of Mendeleev, who gave us the periodic table. And on the right, you see the picture of Darwin, who gave us the ideas of natural selection and biological evolution. In the middle of the slide, you will see the many, many images that you can now find on the internet of the coronavirus. The coronavirus has dominated our discussions for the entire year. And you might therefore ask, is the coronavirus a part of chemistry or is the coronavirus a part of biology? The virus by itself is an inanimate object. And in order for the virus to multiply, it needs to infect a cell. And therefore, viruses might rightly be considered as inhabiting the no man's land between chemistry and biology. But this no man's land between chemistry and biology is like the line of actual control between two countries. It changes and shifts with time and with progress in science. In addition to chemistry and biology, I've used the word nature. And I cannot do better than to quote from the first editorial in volume 1, issue number 1 of 1869 in the journal Nature. When the journal Nature started, Thomas Huxley was asked to write the editorial. Huxley, instead of writing the entire editorial, simply reproduced an essay by the German poet Johann Goethe. And this is what Goethe said. He said, "Nature, we are surrounded and embraced by her, powerless to separate ourselves from her and powerless to penetrate beyond her." The editorial begins with a quotation from the English Renaissance poet, Wordsworth, who says, "To the solid ground of nature trust the mind which builds for aye." So nature is something that concerns all of us. And of course, the journal which uses the name Nature is now one of the most important journals in science, and I think earth scientists also like very much to publish in Nature. I'm going to start with Darwin. Read you a sentence from The Origin of Species. Darwin says, "There is grandeur in this way of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. And that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." He's really talking about the beauty of biological evolution, the remarkable diversity of life forms that you see in biology, microorganisms, plants, animals, so on. Darwin wondered about the origin of life. And in 1863, in letters to a friend, he wrote this. In the March of 1863, he says, "It is mere rubbish thinking at present of origin of life. One might as well think of origin of matter." In the mid-19th century, neither the origin of life nor the origin of matter were subjects that could be easily considered. But in 1871, in another letter to the same friend, he said, and I read only one sentence in the middle, which he says, "But if, and oh what a big if we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes." He's really beginning to think here about the evolution of biochemistry, and biochemistry is central to life. So chemistry must evolve first, biochemistry must follow, and only then can we get living cells. So we're really going to be thinking a little bit about the origins of matter and the origins of life. Biochemistry is a subject which I have practiced for many years. The origins of biochemistry can be traced to this study by Edward Buchner in 1896, 1897. What he did was very simple. The reaction that he studied was a reaction that all of you know. That is the conversion of sugar to alcohol, fermentation, sucrose going to ethyl alcohol. But how is this done? This is done with yeast. What the experiment that Buchner did was, instead of taking yeast cells, what he did was he crushed the yeast cells and made it into a soup. He filtered the soup and he took then what is called a cell-free extract. And he showed that this cell-free extract could now again carry out the reaction of fermentation. Not only had he established that all the chemical reactions of life are actually carried out by molecules, and that there are many catalysts which are present, which are what we today call enzymes. The other pillar of science that I showed you on my first slide is Mendeleev's periodic table. This would be somewhat more familiar to all of you, because as earth scientists, you're very often involved in thinking about geology and in thinking about mining. And all the elements that we use industrially come from the earth. I've only shown you a part of Mendeleev's periodic table. I've colored in green those elements which are important for organic chemistry. And organic chemistry is essential for biochemistry. I've also colored in pink many of the other metals, which are in fact transition metals or the alkaline earth metals, which might now be important also in biochemistry. Now it turns out that many elements of Mendeleev's periodic table are essential for life. And we might now ask, how do the elements form? And if there are students listening, I really want to draw your attention to this book. It is Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man. This is a book based on a TV series produced for the BBC in the early 1970s. The narrator of this series was the physicist Jacob Bronowski. It's a marvelous series. You can find episodes still available on YouTube, and you must listen. Bronowski talks about the building up of the elements. He says, in all the stars there are going on processes which build up the atoms one by one into more complex structures. And then his most important sentence, matter itself evolves. The word comes from Darwin and biology, but it is the word that changed physics in my lifetime. I want you to think about this. The word evolution really changes our lives. And as we come towards the end, I will touch upon some aspects of evolution as they pertain to the earth sciences and also as they pertain to culture. Bronowski talks about carbon, which is so essential for all of us. Carbon, for instance, is formed in a star when 3 helium nuclei collide at one spot within less than 1/1,000,000th of a millionth of a second. Every carbon atom in every living creature has been formed by such a wildly improbable collision. You can't think of a more beautiful sentence than this. Life itself is improbable because the formation of carbon itself is so improbable in the stars. Biology is a vast subject, but nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. This is the title of a very famous essay written by the American evolutionist Theodosius Dobzhansky. And what Dobzhansky said is this. He asked a question, does the evolutionary doctrine clash with religious faith? This is because in the West, particularly in the United States, there have been famous clashes between the church, people who are religious, and evolutionists. He says it does not. It is a blunder to mistake the Holy Scriptures for elementary textbooks of astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology. Only if symbols are construed to mean what they are not intended to mean can there arise imaginary, insoluble conflicts. This is something that we must keep in mind. But the subject that I really wanted to talk to you about is the subject in which I was trained. As I moved ahead in my research career, I drifted from chemistry to biology. But at heart, I've always been a follower of chemistry. I can't do better than to quote Arthur Kornberg, the famous biochemist. Kornberg is the man who discovered DNA polymerase and fired the first shot of the biotechnology revolution in the early 1950s. Kornberg called chemistry the lingua franca of the medical and biological sciences. Today, if medical education and biology education in India suffer, it is because of the lack of emphasis on chemistry, which is absolutely essential for doing frontline research in biology and medicine. Is chemistry useful? This is a question that one might ask. But I want to show you this essay. This essay appeared in 1999. In 1999, those of you who are old will remember this, all of us were looking forward to a new century. We were also looking forward to a new millennium. So the 21st century was about to be born. And the journal Nature had commissioned a set of essays. At that time, I was the editor of Current Science, and I would like to write, and I needed a subject. So I used to read all the Nature essays with great interest. The one essay which has stuck in my mind is this one, which is called Detonator of the Population Explosion. Written by the Canadian scientist Václav Smil. I quote only one sentence. The world might be better off without Microsoft and CNN, and neither nuclear reactors nor space shuttles are critical to human well-being. But the world's population would not have grown from 1.6 billion to today's 6 billion. This was 20 years ago, now it's 7, without the Haber-Bosch process. This immediately reminded me of my undergraduate chemistry, because that's when we studied the Haber-Bosch process for the industrial synthesis of ammonia. And I show you the Haber-Bosch process. It begins with gaseous nitrogen and hydrogen, subjects them to high pressure, high temperature, and exposes them to a catalyst, and lo and behold, you get ammonia. Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch independently got Nobel Prizes at 2 different times for their contributions to chemistry. But why is the synthesis of ammonia so important? The synthesis of ammonia is important because it is from ammonia that you make urea. And urea was the first fertilizer to revolutionize agriculture. So the moment this happened in the early decades of the 20th century, agricultural production increased dramatically and the famines of the past receded. This is very, very important because chemistry triggered the first agricultural revolution of the 20th century. Nature also needs ammonia for biochemistry, but it fixes it from atmospheric nitrogen. It fixes it at room temperature in an aqueous solution under very mild conditions, exactly the opposite of the conditions used in the industrial synthesis of ammonia. Yet it is able to do this with a biological catalyst, an enzyme called nitrogenase, which interestingly enough uses both iron and molybdenum, elements found in the Earth's crust, at its core. Is chemistry important? It is very important. I show you another molecule, a simple molecule. I've shown you ammonia. Now I show you dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, better known by its abbreviation, DDT. Mueller received the Nobel Prize a couple of years after the discovery of DDT, because DDT turned out to be an extraordinary poison against a variety of insects. It killed the malarial mosquito, Plasmodium falciparum was killed by DDT. It also killed many of the insects which destroyed crops. So here was a simple chemical immediately available, which impacted both medicine and agriculture. Today, if you think about India, the 2 most important subjects in which we need to make an impact are medicine and agriculture, health and food. Chemistry has done this in the past in a fairly simple way. But does chemistry come without any problems? No, it does not, just as much of science does not. In the early 1960s, this book appeared by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. This is a classic. This is the book which launched the environmental movement. And today, if we are conscious of green chemistry, one can trace the origins of the environmental movement back to Silent Spring. Carson drew her inspiration from the worries that we've had with atomic energy. The atomic bombs exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki had terrible effects on the generations that followed. So she says, we are rightly appalled by the genetic effects of radiation. How then can we be indifferent to the same effect in chemicals that we disseminate widely in our environment? And so chemistry has given rise to some remarkable molecules. It has also spawned the environmental movement. But many times new disciplines arise by a convergence of interest. And here I quote Thomas Eisner, the founding father of a field called chemical ecology, in which I am now engaged. Chemical ecology is the product of a partnership between biologists and natural products chemists, united by a shared vision and empowered by complementary skills. These are his words. He goes on to say, the vision stems from the realization that all organisms emit chemical signals and that all in their respective ways respond to the chemical emissions of others. This is something you must think about. You live, walk, and breathe because all the cells in your body are cooperating, collaborating, and communicating with one another. How does this communication happen? It is entirely chemical. But except human beings, all other living organisms communicate by means of chemicals. Plants communicate with insects. Insects communicate with other insects. Animals communicate sometimes with one another. Almost none of them use sound and language the way we do. So chemistry and biology are therefore intertwined in many ways. But even in biology, there has been this feeling that chemistry is a distant subject and that biochemistry is slowly disappearing. The famous molecular biologist, Sidney Brenner, who incidentally was trained as a physical chemist, wrote this essay again in the year 2000. He says, I once made the remark that two things disappeared in 1990. One was communism, the other was biochemistry, and that only one of these should be allowed to come back. He was, of course, talking about the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. But global communism has never really gone away, and Brenner obviously did not come to India. He didn't visit states at that time like Kerala, Bengal, and so on. But biochemistry, he went on to say, does not have to be resurrected. It will flourish because it provides the only experimental basis for a causal understanding of biological mechanisms. I want to show you a second major advance in agriculture. This is also the result of very, very simple chemistry, the 1945 Nobel Prize to the Finnish scientist Arturi Virtanen. The citation mentions his inventions in agricultural and nutritional chemistry for fodder preservation. This is because of the cold Scandinavian winters during the Second World War. Whatever had been harvested must be preserved through the winter. And Virtanen found a way of doing this. He found that you could easily preserve fodder if you now added a mixture of sulfuric and hydrochloric acids to this. This is because the slurry in which it was, the pH was lowered to 4. And once it was lowered to 4, all harmful bacteria no longer grew and fermentation stopped. Today, the preservation of fodder in the form of silage and hay is done by adding microorganisms, good microorganisms, which produce lactic acid. These are the same kind of microorganisms which sometimes are in your gut and allow you to digest everything that you eat. So let me come back to modern biology. Modern biology rests on 3 pillars. Genetics on the left due to Gregor Mendel, again in the 19th century. Evolution by variation and selection due to Darwin on the right, again in the mid-19th century. And chemistry in the middle, where the genetics of heredity was understood. The chemistry of heredity was understood. This happened when Oswald Avery recognized that DNA is the genetic material in his famous experiments on the pneumococcal transforming principle. And Watson and Crick gave us the double helix that immediately established that hydrogen bonds were important, and the formation and breakage of hydrogen bonds was very important in biological information transmission. But biology is about variation. Children do not resemble their parents beyond a certain extent. They are not identical. Why is this? This is because there is a great deal of variation. There's a great deal of mixing. There's a mixing of genes, and evolution happens by variation and selection. Human beings are not what they were 10,000 years ago. They're certainly not what they were 100,000 years ago, and this is something that you must think about. Your environment also constantly evolves in response to the stresses that are placed upon it. But I will digress for a minute here to tell you that the dominant technologies of our times, information technology and biotechnology, have their roots in fundamental science. Fundamental science is therefore very important. Biology's basis, Avery's work, is the foundation of biotechnology. Claude Shannon's work on the mathematical theory of communication is the work on which all of modern information technology is based. Coincidentally, Shannon's PhD thesis in 1940 was called An Algebra for Theoretical Genetics. Genetics was used in the title of his thesis, implying that there would be a connection between information science and biology. Today, if you look at everything that people talk about, big data, data analytics, where is this important? This is most important in biology and medicine, because that is where the largest amounts of data are being produced. Now, if you look, for instance, at a biochemistry chart, which hangs in biochemistry laboratories, it will look like a road map, chemicals being converted into other chemicals, a network of chemical reactions. And these networks are even more complicated than any of the networks of everyday life, for example, in the power industry. There are nodes, and it is important that networks don't fail, because otherwise life will fail. And all of this happens so wonderfully. Understanding this requires understanding what one might call the logic of metabolism. And it is only in the last few years that many articles have begun to appear where this is being addressed in substantial detail. I know that many of you are from other fields, but what I want to convey is that understanding biology today requires a very strong interdisciplinary perspective. Systems biology, which attempts to understand how cells function really, require now an understanding of mathematics, an understanding of coupled differential equations, many subjects which are completely foreign in our treatment of biology. But in biology and the chemistry that underlies biology, there's a great deal of complexity. This complexity is because even simple chemicals, and I show you one here, this is the chemical capsaicin, which gives the red chili its pungent flavor. To make this chemical, a very large number of chemical reactions have to take place. Each one of these chemical reactions has to be catalyzed by a protein catalyst, an enzyme. And in order to make an enzyme, you need a gene. So an organism invests an enormous amount of genetic and metabolic energy in producing even simple chemicals. Is this important? Is this understanding of genes and enzymes important? I can illustrate this and emphasize this only by digression. And I'm going to digress to an article that I read at the beginning of this year entitled, Does Hurting Make Us Human? This is in the January 6th issue of the magazine The New Yorker. The lady pictured on the left is a Scottish lady who had an unusual clinical problem. She felt no pain and she had no negative emotions. Just imagine, if we could feel no pain and have no negative emotions, we did not dislike anybody, we did not get upset, then how wonderful life would be. There was, however, some biochemical problem with her. What was the problem? In addition to her unusual emotional composition, Cameron is entirely insensitive to physical pain. This was the summary. So when she went in for orthopedic surgery, she did not require any painkillers when she came out of it. One paracetamol is all that she had after a very painful orthopedic surgery. So she was immediately investigated, and powerful teams began to look now at what might be the genetic defect in her, which led to these unusual properties. They discovered that she lacked an enzyme called fatty acid amide hydrolase. Don't worry about its name. All biochemical names are complex. In every field, names are complex to people who are outside the field. But what does this fatty acid amide hydrolase do? There's a chemical in your brain called Anandamide. This should be familiar because it comes from the Sanskrit word Ananda. Anandamide is a chemical which makes you feel happy. This chemical is broken down into two simple chemicals, arachidonic acid and ethanolamine. Both these chemicals are there in your biochemistry. They are joined together to give anandamide. So your brain constantly produces this chemical, but it must also be broken down constantly. So the brain is in a sort of equilibrium as far as its endogenous concentration of anandamide is concerned. Why is anandamide so important? Where does it act in the brain? It turns out that anandamide acts in the brain at the same receptor where the active constituents of marijuana or hashish act, where the constituents of cannabis act, the cannabinoid receptor. I show on the left side of the slide the chemical structure of tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the active constituent of marijuana. Marijuana has been used in India for thousands of years. It's used elsewhere too. Today, of course, marijuana is much in the news because the Narcotics Agency does not seem to have anything more important than to find film stars who have got 100 grams of marijuana with them. But all this work on marijuana and understanding of anandamide was done by a single Israeli scientist and his collaborators. In the Journal of the American Chemical Society in 1964, he published the structure of tetrahydrocannabinol. But he always wondered, and this is something you must wonder too, why is something produced by a plant, how does it have such an effect on your own physiology? Why are plants producing these chemicals? They must be producing those chemicals because they have some use for them. That's what chemical ecologists study. Plants are not doing all this chemistry and biology for your benefit and mine. In order to find the natural molecule, what he did was the experiment that I'm going to show you on the next slide, which was published in Science in 1992. The left side is a biological experiment. The right side is a chemical experiment. And Raphael Mechoulam, the Israeli scientist who discovered both tetrahydrocannabinol and anandamide, has done this wonderful work. He showed the structure of anandamide and then everything was understood. He was asked by a newspaper reporter, why did you not give a name from Hebrew? Why did you pick a name from Sanskrit? He said, we looked for a Hebrew name, but as you may well be aware, Jews are not very happy. We have a lot of words for being down and so on, but not so many words for extreme joy. This, of course, teaches you a little bit of history. To summarize what I've said so far, if you have a substrate, which is a molecule, and you want to convert it to a product, you need an enzyme. And if you need an enzyme, you need a gene. Therefore, to make any chemical in biology, you need many genes. And all these genes must now be regulated in some complex way. It's almost like a factory producing in an assembly line process a final product. The high priest of molecular biology, Francis Crick, as early as 1958, intuitively recognized this. We didn't know all of this at that time. He said, it is at first sight paradoxical that it is probably easier for an organism to produce a new protein than to produce a new small molecule. So this then means that biology requires a great deal of biochemical complexity in order even to produce the simplest of chemicals, which a chemist can very easily do in the laboratory. Today we've moved very fast. Genome sequences are available, and as many as 789 eukaryotic genomes were available when I made this slide a short while ago. The human genome itself had been sequenced nearly 20 years ago. Today we know the evolutionary relationships between these genomes. I only want you to look at the right-hand side of the slide. My title said Unity of Nature. This tells you something about the unity of nature when you realize that chimpanzees and human beings are very close to one another, very closely spaced branches on an ever-expanding genetic tree. Rats and mice are on the same side. So are pig, cattle and sheep. Today when we fight about pigs and cattle, we must remember that they are very closely related. Horses, dogs, sheep, all closely related to us. This is really the unity of biology, which is demonstrated by genetic similarities and also by almost complete biochemical similarity. Biological data is expanding enormously. In real time, you can see the data expanding on the internet on this site. And so we have a great deal of work to do to understand all of the information that is now being generated. But as I approach the end of my presentation, I will turn to something that might be somewhat more familiar to you, the timetable of evolution. As earth scientists, your discipline will really begin about 567 million years ago, 5.6 billion years ago, when the earth was formed. Before that, it's the realm of people in other disciplines. The physicists who worry about the universe, who worry about how the planets were formed and so forth. And you can see now that the nomenclature on this slide, which I have taken from an article in 2017 in Science Advances, is of course completely from the discipline of the earth sciences. The origins of life themselves can be traced back to archaebacteria, which probably appeared about 3.5 billion years ago. But it turns out that for much of the Earth's history, there were no more complicated organisms than unicellular organisms. But the Earth also had an atmosphere which did not have oxygen. So oxygenic biochemistry had not started. The grand oxygenation event, which happened about 2.5 billion years ago, happened because of the evolution of photosynthetic organisms, which now realized that sunlight could be used, it could be harvested, and chlorophyll had evolved. So the molecule chlorophyll has to evolve first. And it's only after photosynthesis evolves will oxygen now be the source of energy. And now you can see that once that happened, life began to diversify. Macroscopic animals are available. You begin to see the origins of animals some about 500 billion years ago, quickly diversifying in what you call the Cambrian period. But as you go along, you will find that plants came substantially later, and the very large animals and all were significantly later. And primates and human beings are very much later. In fact, human beings have been around for a very short time as far as the Earth's life is concerned. But the timetable of evolution, which we know today, is really because of research which I think requires the earth scientists, paleobiologists, anthropologists, everyone, paleontologists, everybody to cooperate, use the most sophisticated isotope dating methods which are available in order to understand how life evolved on Earth. But that's biological evolution. How did chemistry evolve on Earth? The origins of life require that simple chemicals must form. There's this famous experiment of Stanley Miller in the laboratory at the University of Chicago in 1953, where he flashed an electric discharge through a mixture of ammonia, methane, water, steam, and hydrogen, collected the residue and put it on a paper chromatogram and showed that the amino acids were formed. That is the top left picture on the slide. Those dots are amino acids, which are the constituents of proteins. And therefore, this was called the origins of life experiment. In America, they preserve their history, and this sample was preserved. 50 years later, it was re-examined using the new techniques of electrospray ionization mass spectrometry. And now in Miller's residue were found many, many more chemicals. Because what we see of every experiment or what we see of nature depends really on the tools with which we investigate. So we know a little bit about the origin of chemicals. What about cells? Rudolf Virchow said many years ago that all cells must come from cells. But then which one was the first cell? What we call the last universal common ancestor. It is from this cell that every branch of the tree of life with which we are familiar today must have diversified. Bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. The tree of life, as taught to biology students, is a humbling tree of life. Because if you look at the bottom part, you will see to corn. Biology is so diverse. Sometimes when we are completely involved in human affairs, fighting with one another, we sort of forget the grandness of nature. What about prebiology? Here's an interesting molecule, hydrogen cyanide. Poisonous, all of you know that. Hitler used it. Where did these molecules come from? They could have come from the comets. Water itself may have come from the comets, and I believe that Earth scientists worry about what the origins of the oceans might have been. These are grand questions. But here, for example, is a spectroscopic measurement of the Hale-Bopp comet. Formaldehyde and hydrogen. And if formaldehyde and hydrogen cyanide can be found, then of course a paper which appeared 3 years ago shows that with these simple chemicals and with a little bit of copper, light which is available, copper which is available, and sulfide which you have in plenty in the earth, these all of them put together begin to give you the complexity of biochemistry. You can see emergence here of molecules. So the vital question, and this is the title of a book by Nick Lane, is why is life the way it is? Bacteria evolved into complex life just once in 4 billion years of life on Earth. All complex life shares many strange properties, from sex to aging and death. If life evolved on other planets, would it be the same or completely different? This is a grand question. But I'm now running out of time, so I will very quickly come to the final part of my presentation. I will show you the world, the map of the world in the Mercator projection as we see it today. Wasn't always like this, and that all of you as earth scientists know. But you can see that in this picture, 200,000 years ago, Australia looks slightly different. And maybe that's the way it was. But what are we interested in? We are interested in the grey patch in the east of Africa, where the first precursors for human beings were beginning to evolve. That grey patch, and this is taken directly from the internet, 32,000 BC has spread. Now you can see that when we come to 32,000 BC, humanoids have gone all over. At the time look at all the controversies in India, we fight with one another about what might have happened 3,000 years ago, or what might have happened about 5,000 years ago, and sometimes even what might have happened about 800 years ago. But you might ask a grander question. Why are we the way we are? What happened? Now, in order to trace the origins of human beings and our own origins, it will turn out that it will be modern biology which will do this. Ancient DNA will rewrite the prehistory of India. A journalist, Tony Joseph, in his award-winning book, Early Indians, wrote this. And this is the analysis of DNA extracted from individuals who lived tens of thousands of years ago. This requires the investigations of fossils. The fossil record is what tells us about our past history. But the analysis of ancient DNA is very recent. I retired in the year 2014. There was almost no ancient DNA known at that time. And today you can see the boom in ancient DNA samples and the way technology is moving ahead. So in the final part of my presentation, I will ask a question. Is there any connection between history and biology? Because when we talk about evolution, we are talking about evolutionary history. You can do no better than to read this book by the Israeli historian Yuval Harari, Sapiens, very popular book, found in all the airport bookshops. Harari, a biologist, appears to have a better understanding of biological evolution than most biologists. And what he says is this: the immense diversity of imagined realities that Sapiens invented and the resulting diversity of behavior patterns are the main components of what we call cultures. Once cultures appeared, they never cease to change and develop, and these unstoppable alterations are what we call history. And he says, the cognitive revolution is accordingly the point when history declared its independence from biology. He goes on to say that to understand the rise of Christianity or the French Revolution, it is not enough to comprehend the interaction of genes, hormones, and organisms. It is necessary to take into account the interaction of ideas, images, and fantasies as well. And you might ask, when did these images, fantasies, and the cognitive revolution really begin to take place? For that, we need to go back to Bronowski, The Ascent of Man. He begins his final chapter by quoting Wordsworth again, who says, "For nature to me was all in all." I will read Bronowski. Among the multitude of animals which scamper, fly, burrow, and swim around us, man is the only one who is not locked into his environment. His imagination, his reason, his emotional subtlety and toughness make it possible for him not to accept the environment but to change it. And that series of inventions by which man from age to age has remade his environment, it is a different kind of evolution, not biological, but cultural evolution. I call that brilliant sequence of cultural peaks the ascent of man. Cultural evolution has been driven by science and technology and not by religion. And this is something that one must remember. Has evolved very quickly, and today sociologists do look at this problem. In an article in 2017 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, interesting questions are asked about the relationship between cultural evolution and biological evolution. I will show you only one question. The question is, can cultural evolution influence biological evolution? Here is the example. You know, for much of human history, there was little reason to digest milk after weaning. Babies drank their mother's milk, but afterwards they never drank milk. And adults did not typically produce the enzyme that digests lactose, which is the major sugar in milk. Animals don't drink milk except immediately after birth, the mammals. When did the human beings start drinking milk? They started drinking milk when the practice of dairy farming was invented. It's a scientific, agriculture is a science, and the invention of agriculture is probably one of the most important things in the ascent of man, in triggering what one might call the domestication of human beings, from hunter-gatherers to people who stay stationary in one place. So when you stay stationary, you have to protect your fields, and you have to protect. Form groups of people, you need to evolve societies. And in order to keep societies together, you need to evolve myths. And that is when myths began to evolve in the human mind. The population genetics of lactase persistence is an interesting example. If you look at the enzyme lactase, it disappears in most of us after birth. But today it is persistent in large sections of the population. But if you look at this persistence between Scandinavia and the southernmost tip of Africa, it is different. Scandinavia, almost everybody can digest milk. But in the southernmost tip of Africa, almost nobody can digest milk. They have what is called lactose intolerance. Even in India, between the north and the south, there are fairly dramatic differences in how much of lactose intolerance there is. And if you have lactose intolerance, you will have indigestion, you may have diarrhea, and you will have stomach problems. 30,000 years ago, these would have led to dehydration and death. And therefore, over a period of time, Darwinian selection has selected out those individuals who can survive, and their successors have, of course, carried the appropriate genes. This is the rare example of cultural, or what one might call a scientific influence on human practices, which results in biological evolution. Last thing I want to say is about my subject, chemistry. On the left is the tree of life, which is at the heart of biology. And the man whom I've pictured here is Carl Ruiz, who discovered the third branch of the tree of life, archaea. Archaea are what most earth scientists who dig deep down into the earth are likely to encounter, where there are conditions of high pressure and high temperature. Microbiology determines a great deal of what happens on the earth, because microbes are very much more, much larger in numbers than anything else on earth. When Carl Ruiz died, I found a tribute to him on the internet put up by an admirer, who had apparently quoted Pliny the Elder, which said, "Nature is to be found in her entirety nowhere more than in her smallest creatures." He put this up as a tribute to microbiology. I would like to paraphrase this to say that chemistry is to be found in her entirety nowhere more than in nature's smallest creatures. That it is the study of the most unusual microbes, those which might be found only by collaboration with earth scientists, which are likely to lead to new and novel chemistries. At the end of my presentation, you might ask, why do I draw your attention to such a disparate group of subjects? It is because of the environment, climatic, social, and political, in which we live today. Some reflection on the roles of chemistry and biology in shaping nature may allow us to introspect on the course of human history and attempt to understand why the world today is the way it is. Science is a deeply humbling subject. I hope I have conveyed to you how any attempt to understand even the smallest of nature's creations can be deeply humbling. And on this, in the last slide, I will turn to the coronavirus. It's a public health nightmare and an artist's delight. What is the coronavirus? What is a virus? I can't do better than to quote from Peter Medawar, the famous British immunologist. He wrote a dictionary of biology called From Aristotle to Zeus, A to Z. And there, if you go under V, you will find the definition of a virus. And he called this a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein. The piece of bad news is the ribonucleic acid inside the virus, which is what it needs to replicate. The protein is what protects this genetic material. But the protein is also the one which engages now. Those spikes that you see, the spike protein which everybody is talking about, which allow it to find the cells in your body to which it can attach, get inside, and use the cellular machinery to replicate. The virus is a true parasitic organism. But this understanding of the virus will come only if one understands chemistry and one understands biology. And one also asks the evolutionary question, when did viruses evolve? And what is our relationship with viruses? That brings me then to the end of my presentation. I would really like to thank the two institutions which have provided me an opportunity to work during my entire career, the Indian Institute of Science, where I was for very close to 41 years, and the National Center of Biological Sciences of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which now provides me a home and shelter in my post-retirement days. Lastly, I would like to thank all of you for listening, and also thank the director and all the scientists at NGRI Hyderabad for inviting me, and to wish you all the very best in your Diamond Jubilee year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Balaram, for this very interesting, thought-provoking talk. You have highlighted the importance of chemistry in life while giving a very honest appraisal of its pros and cons. You have taken us through an exciting journey of chemistry, biology, and its various combinations, including biochemistry, microbiology, genetics, and such a diverse range of fields, including agriculture, nutrition, even earth science, history, and cultural evolution, and finally culminating into unity of nature as you promised. In the process, you have also apprised us of several path-breaking research works till date, while quoting some of the most important works, which I think are a must-read for all of us. So thank you very much, sir. I hope you would like to take a few questions.
Yeah, sure, I can.
So anyone online can ask a question. Can we have the spotlight on Professor Balaram, please? Professor, go ahead. Maybe you'd like to ask. So I have a few questions here which have been sent by some of the viewers who are watching online. We have Dr. Shiv Shankar Ganguly, who wants to know, how do we foresee life and evolution in future? Will it be dominated mostly by nature or human intervention?
Yeah, we on this one can only speculate. I suspect excessive human intervention will also result in nature reacting, and when that happens, I think evolution will eventually be driven by nature. We are a part of nature.
Yes. So one of the scientists has asked this question, that could you highlight on the importance of oxygen in the evolution that we have talked about, and also the genetic evolution, the importance of oxygen?
Yes, today, for example, we need oxygen. That, of course, the coronavirus has demonstrated rather dramatically, because that is what is given to all people whose lungs are now affected by the virus. Oxygen is used in our mitochondria in the process by which we produce energy, a biochemical process called oxidative phosphorylation, in which effectively what happening is you're burning glucose and producing energy. And this requires electrons to be removed from organic molecules, but they must go somewhere. And the terminal electron acceptor is oxygen. And the production of ATP requires the production of the presence of oxygen. This is why if you poison mitochondria, cyanide, for example, attacks cytochrome oxidase. And so it is an instant poison. So oxygen is essential. But you might ask other simple questions. When you see a chemical structure and which you need, cholesterol is a molecule that you need. Many times those who are older think of it as a bad molecule and try to lower their cholesterol levels. But it turns out that you synthesize cholesterol and there's a single oxygen atom in cholesterol, and it is important. Where does it come from? It comes only from oxygen. So before the earth got oxygenated, all the organisms did not use cholesterol. And those were only microorganisms. So biochemistry has evolved in its complexity over time. It's a fascinating thing to think about. Pre-oxygen biochemistry, that is anaerobic biochemistry, and post-oxygen biochemistry. In fact, here I think there is a need for a lot of interdisciplinary work.
Sir, I have a question. At the high school level, I studied genetics with great passion and great interest. So one thing that has always fascinated me is the concept of mutation.
Yes.
We are also seeing the mutation of coronavirus, which makes us feel so helpless.
Yes.
So what exactly controls this process of mutation, and how frequent is it, and can we actually depend on the genetic theories that have been told about crossing between parents and things like that, but then suddenly you find that genes are totally altered by mutations which seem to suddenly spring out from nowhere. So what exactly is happening, and particularly with reference to coronavirus, what would you like to say about it?
With respect to the coronavirus and with respect to all viruses, it's a fairly easy thing to understand, because once the virus gets in, each got a nucleic acid strand, in this case RNA. Now this strand has to be reproduced exactly. Now if there are mistakes when it's being reproduced, there will be mutations. But since this is happening, even though this sort of transcription and translation, which are the two processes by which information is taken to the next generation, they are almost foolproof. They are not completely foolproof. And the more quickly it happens, the greater the chances of mutations. The result is viruses mutate very rapidly. Human beings don't mutate very rapidly, no. Many times we have mutations caused by external chemicals which can cause mutations, or mutations caused by UV light. Skin cancer, for example, happens because of UV damage. So mutational effects happen in human beings also, but on a much slower time scale. But biology selects from the mutations. It selects the variants which survive the best. Even the coronavirus will eventually come to terms, and we will coexist with the coronavirus in future. But that's a long future. You're muted, Dr. Rao.
Yeah, I think Dr. Tiwari would like to ask a question. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Rao. Sir, I have just a curiosity. As you are aware that over millions of years, the position of the Earth has been changing. And that's what we work in paleomagnetism, try to fix the poles of its drift, of the how continent drifted from one place to another place. So I wonder that if we try to put the great oxidation event as a global event and change the geographical locations. So what we are talking of the bacteria, whether the kinds of the bacteria at the different continents are different locations, were different or they evolved of the similar kinds, because we have the oxygen events and we also have the development of life at that time.
Yeah, I don't know this with respect to bacteria, but with respect to animals, you can see this distinction quite clearly. For example, you will not find kangaroos outside Australia. And long ago, the dodo, which is one of the more recent extinctions, used to be there only in the island of Madagascar. So they kind of were isolated environments. I don't know about bacteria. And also, vast majority of bacteria and even viruses are there in the sea. And the sea to land, actually, most people talking about viruses don't know that the largest reservoir of viruses is the sea. We don't know yet. Marine biology is what one might call a future frontier in many ways.
Thank you, sir, because we are excited and we know that amongst the top 10 questions, one of them is the origin of the life. And as we go deep in the Earth's past, we start seeing the signatures of the existence of the life. But what is happening is that we have been drilling or trying to find out some of the places, but at certain places we don't find the in the similar rock kind of the same kind of the signatures. So that's what I thought that it might be changing even what we see in the present day in the ocean, that even in the form of the bacterial diversities.
No, I don't think it's very easy to reconstruct the past without a kind of fossil record which you have, which you can study. And fossil records are very difficult to get. And I must say, because so many of you are here and senior people like Dr. Goel are also there, that subjects like paleobotany, paleobiology, anthropology, archaeology, these are not strong subjects in India in all the best places. Even the earth sciences has come to the Indian Institute of Science very late. So yes. It is not...
one of our senior colleague had been writing, and he sends a message that your editorial in Current Science in 2004 after the tsunami. So how do you see now the progress after 2004 in the earth science? Like you say that the very new subject at the IISc Bangalore Earth Sciences. So because you are the person whom we have learned many things through the editorial and your vast range of the reading interest.
I have to say this, that disciplines evolve, and maybe even earth sciences, they evolve only very slowly. So I don't know whether an impact of starting any new activity will be felt for a long period of time. But I wish there were more places in which there was collaboration between people in earth sciences and in biology and in physics and chemistry. Because then I think in India now collaborations are increasing. This there are very many more collaborations now in India than there used to be before. communication has become much easier, and travel also, except for the coronavirus, has simplified matters. I think we can look forward to, but of late, I think our emphasis has not been there on all of this. We are not emphasizing education. We are not emphasizing interdisciplinary science. We are not emphasizing science itself very much. So I don't know what students will face in the future. If you ask me, I feel that if I look back, I think my future as a student is probably better than the future of a student today. And that, I think, is sad. That's not a sign of evolution.
Sir, I remember in one of our last research council meeting, Professor Singhvi had made a suggestion to us of joining with CCMB and working with geoscience, and you are now chair of the research council of the CCMB. Professor Singhvi is online. I think he may like to say. Professor Singhvi?
Yes. I think half of the geology is biology, if you look at in seriousness. And we have ignored biology totally. So I think whatever has been said by Professor Balaram has to be put into action. And look at all the fossil evidences in terms of RNA, DNA, virus, and then see how the microbes have been affecting us in terms of heat production. So this is the entire new area of research, and you are ideally placed with the two sister institutions, CCMB and IACT, along with you. I think very new branches of science could emerge from NGRI.
I think Hyderabad, if I may interrupt, ideally positioned because you also have CDFD there, which is now the leading place for DNA sequencing.
Yes.
So, and there is another laboratory which will keep microbial cultures. So, I think a consortium of places, if they work together, they produce wonders. The earth sciences has the advantage that your laboratory is not available to other people. See, quantum physics or anybody can do, or chemistry, it's the same thing. But India, ecology, biology, the local environment is there.
And what you said about its marine environment also, I think NGRI is the right place to grow those new subjects in a wholesome manner with the critical mass around them. So their focus has to be of bringing in interdisciplinary things like biology and link up with CCMB, which has an enormous, and CFD and IACT, who have enormous experience to bring in synergy to help understand how we have come around. I think, Professor Balaram, it was a fascinating talk. I will hear it once again, and I request for Dr. Tiwari to share this talk again. It was a fascinating, what a range you have covered. My compliments, sir.
Nice to see you.
You always amaze us. You always amaze us.
So far, I've only been writing emails to you, but nice to see you in person.
I hope you're not disappointed.
Thank you, Professor Singh.
Good morning. Just 1 minute. I would like to thank Professor Balaram for this fascinating talk. The subject of our science, which was mentioned, and the way we have looked at our science so far is from a very, very limited scope. In fact, when we created the Ministry of Earth Science, even though our intentions were very clear that we would like to integrate all the three aspects of atmosphere, ocean, geology, and earth-related things. But so far, we have limited ourselves into integrating ocean and atmosphere, and that too for a very limited purpose of, understanding the phenomena related to the ocean, like cyclone or rain or related things. Even earthquake, we have not integrated properly with respect to the sciences. So there's a lot to be done. Again, the question is, when we really talk of institute like NGRI, our focus really has to be on geosciences and geo-related things. But then again, what's the kind of manpower we get, how much diversity we can provide? It's a open question, even though RC has a role to play. But even RC, to what extent we can go in terms of providing those kind of resources in terms of manpower and money. We are so much restricted by the government system. You think of slightly addition of manpower and there is 100 question asked why you need that. In fact, everyone is looking at the Ministry of Finance looks at how do we reduce the support rather than how do we support science. So there are much more issues at the national level, and as I said, RC has a very limited role to play. But certainly the takeaway from today's talk and interaction with which Professor Singh has mentioned in the RC also, we have a lot to think about it and do a lot of churning before we really come up with very concrete. But let me again say, Professor Balaram, it has been a wonderful listening to you, a fascinating talk and trying to understand, at least for me, there are a lot of things new for me. I'm mostly a person from the space, but still I'm trying to understand things related to the science, related to the biology, related to the chemistry. It's a fascinating talk. Thank you very much for being with us at NGRI today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Professor Rao, could we close now?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Goel and Professor Singh, for the useful remarks and also showing very useful direction with respect to today's very important talk. In fact, I remember that when we were involved in scientific deep drilling in Koina for earthquake studies, we came across the possibility of studying microbes at depth, which is something like at 1.5 kilometers depth that we drilled. And suddenly, as an offshoot, a totally new option, a new opportunity arose, and then we had other scientists coming into the play. So thank you very much, sir. I think it was very, very important and very, I should say, exciting talk that we heard today. And we must really thank you once again for accepting our invitation and to because it's such an important occasion of Diamond Jubilee celebration, and that you participated in this important function. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.